Every single air-breathing animal on this planet, including you, descends from something that crawled out of the ocean and decided land was worth the risk. That decision took hundreds of millions of years to pay off. And then, almost immediately by geological standards, something turned around and walked straight back into the water. Not whales. Not dolphins. Not the giant marine reptiles that would later share the seas with dinosaurs. Something far stranger, far older, and far less talked about. Something that went back into the water less than 75 million years after the very first vertebrate had managed to hold any part of its own body weight up on dry land. If that sounds fast, it should. In evolutionary terms, that is barely enough time to get comfortable on land before deciding it wasn't worth it. This is the story of that animal, and of the strangest, most lethal, most quietly terrifying sea this planet has ever produced. We're going to call him Vren. He was a Mesosaurus, and he was born into a body of water that nothing in the modern world has any real equivalent for. By the time you understand what that sea actually was, you will understand why almost nothing else lived there. And why that absence was the only reason any of this story survived long enough for us to tell it to you now. Vren's world existed roughly 280 million years ago, in the early Permian, inside a vast inland sea that geologists now call the Irati-Whitehill Sea, named for fossil formations on two continents that, at the time, were not separated by an ocean at all. They were the same coastline. Vren's sea sat in the heart of the supercontinent Pangaea, before Pangaea had even finished assembling itself, occupying a stretch of southern Pangaea roughly twice the size of the Mediterranean Sea, almost entirely enclosed by land, and at certain points in its history, completely cut off from any other body of water on Earth. An inland ocean with no outlet, no current exchange, nowhere for anything trapped inside it to escape to. And the water itself was not what you imagine an ancient sea to look like. It was layered. Stratified, the way the modern Caspian Sea is stratified today, distinct bands of water stacked on top of each other, separated by differences in salinity and density so severe that they almost never mixed. Near the surface, the water Vren swam through was livable. But beneath a certain depth, and the geological evidence suggests the depth was disturbingly shallow, much shallower than in a normal stratified sea, the water turned anoxic. Completely without oxygen. A poison layer sitting in permanent darkness beneath the world Vren actually lived in, and Vren would have known, on some level encoded into every instinct he had, exactly where that boundary was. Cross it, and you didn't come back up. Here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. That anoxic layer is the entire reason we know Vren existed at all. Because almost nothing else lived in this sea. No bony fish to speak of. Almost none of the giant amphibians, the temnospondyls, that dominated practically every other freshwater and coastal ecosystem on the planet during this exact period. The only common animals sharing Vren's water were strange clawless crustaceans called pygocephalomorphs, now completely extinct, and the occasional freshwater shark. That is the entire guest list for one of the largest inland seas that has ever existed. And the reason for that emptiness is the same reason this story can be told at all. When something died in Vren's world and sank below that lethal anoxic boundary, there was nothing left alive down there to scavenge the body. No bottom feeders. No bacteria-driven decay competition. The corpse simply sat in the dark, undisturbed, for long enough that the sediment had time to bury it completely intact before anything could break it down. Vren's sea was, without exaggeration, one of the most efficient fossil preservation machines this planet has ever assembled. And it built that machine by being almost completely uninhabitable to everything except the one animal specialized enough to handle it. Vren was that animal. And what made him capable of surviving in a sea that killed almost everything else is written directly into his body in a way that took scientists over a century to fully decode. His body was built like nothing that had existed before him. Long and narrow, with a streamlined torso engineered to cut through water with minimal drag. His tail was taller than it was wide, not built for walking, not built for crawling, built specifically to undulate side to side the way a crocodile's tail does, driving him forward through the water with the kind of propulsion no land animal needs. His nostrils sat unusually high on his snout, positioned exactly where you would put them if your primary survival strategy was floating at the surface with almost your entire body submerged, breathing through the smallest possible exposed point. And his ribs, this is the detail paleontologists still find remarkable, were unusually thick and dense for an animal his size. The same adaptation seen today in manatees and dugongs, animals that use heavy, dense ribcages as a kind of biological ballast, allowing them to control their buoyancy and hover at a chosen depth without constantly burning energy just to stay there. Vren's skeleton wasn't an accident. It was a diving suit, grown from the inside out, for a million years before anything like it would need to exist again. And on the rare fossil where the soft tissue survived, which almost never happens, except in a sea that's specifically engineered for preservation, scientists found something that confirmed everything the bones had already implied. Webbed feet. Paddle-shaped, fully webbed, built for swimming rather than walking. Vren did not visit the water occasionally. The water was where he belonged. His skull made up a startling proportion of his entire body length, narrow and elongated, sometimes reaching nearly a meter on the largest individuals, and lined with thin, needle-like teeth that pointed outward along the sides of the jaw before curving forward at the front of the mouth. For decades, researchers genuinely believed Vren's kind might have been filter feeders, straining tiny organisms out of the water the way a baleen whale strains krill. That theory turned out to be built on a skeleton with too many teeth reconstructed into it by mistake. The real picture is darker and more specific. Those needle teeth were built to grip, not to strain. Built to catch something soft-bodied and hold it fast while it struggled. And we know exactly what that something was, because Vren's sea preserved not just his bones, but the evidence of what he actually ate. Fossilized stomach contents. Fossilized feces. Fossilized vomit. The pygocephalomorph crustaceans that shared his water make up almost the entire menu. Fish barely register in the record at all. And then there is the detail that should make you sit with this story a little longer than you'd like to. Some of those same stomach contents and regurgitated remains are not crustacean shell fragments at all. They are the bones of juvenile Mesosaurus. Vren's own kind. The specialized jaw built for soft-bodied crustaceans was not well suited to processing the bodies of other Mesosaurus, which suggests this wasn't a primary hunting strategy. It suggests something more specific and more disturbing, that in a sea this hostile, this starved of alternative prey, with an anoxic death zone sitting just beneath the surface of daily life, cannibalism wasn't a preference. It was simply what happened when you were hungry enough, in a place with almost nothing else left to eat. Vren was not alone in this sea, even if almost nothing else was. Two other names appear constantly in the fossil record alongside Mesosaurus stereosternum and Basilosaurus, smaller, less specialized, with shorter teeth and proportionally smaller heads. For years, paleontologists treated them as entirely separate species, sharing Vren's water as quieter, less dangerous neighbors. The more unsettling possibility, and the one increasingly supported by recent research, is that they were never separate animals at all. They were Vren. Just younger. Stereosternum-sized specimen smaller than full Mesosaurus, Basilosaurus-sized specimen smaller still, an entire growth sequence that had been mistakenly split into three different species because nobody had connected the dots. If that interpretation holds, then every juvenile in this story, every smaller and more vulnerable shape moving through the same lethal water, every potential meal mentioned a moment ago, was simply Vren's own kind at an earlier stage of the exact same life he was living. There is one more piece of this puzzle that genuinely changes the shape of Vren's entire existence, and it was only uncovered recently. A handful of poorly preserved skulls discovered in Uruguay, in rock that would once have sat along the ancient coastline rather than deep in the lagoon interior, turned out to be dramatically larger than anything previously assigned to this species. Scaled up, some researchers believe the full animal may have reached over 2 meters in length, nearly double the typical specimen pulled from the legendary fossil beds everyone already knew about. And the leading explanation for why these giants are so rare, while the smaller specimens number in the thousands, is almost poetic in its cruelty. The thousands of beautifully preserved Mesosaurus fossils that built this entire field of study may all be juveniles. Young Vrens, trapped for most of their early lives in the harsh, anoxic, fossil-perfect lagoon interior because it was the only environment that could keep them safe from larger predators and larger versions of their own kind. As they aged, as they grew large and capable enough to survive in open water, they would have moved outward, toward the coast, away from the exact conditions that had been quietly mummifying their younger siblings in flawless detail for 250 million years. The adults left. And in leaving, they walked away from the only environment specifically designed to preserve them. Vren's entire species may be famous today almost exclusively for the children who never made it out. None of it lasted. The Irati Whitehill Sea began drying up roughly 5 million years after the world ran new, as the climate of early Permian Pangaea shifted and the inland basin that had sustained this entire bizarre, anoxic, fossil-perfect ecosystem slowly lost the water that defined it. When the sea went, Vren's kind went with it, one of the very first vertebrate lineages in Earth's history to attempt a full return to life in the ocean, and one of the very first to demonstrate, with total finality, that the water that gives a species its advantage can disappear out from under it just as completely as it arrived. He was not the last animal this would happen to. Not even close. Whales, dolphins, the great marine reptiles that would one day swim beneath the dinosaurs, every single one of them was following a path that something had already walked, in total obscurity, hundreds of millions of years earlier, inside a poisoned, stratified, nearly lifeless sea that built one of the finest fossil records on the planet for the simple reason that almost nothing alive could survive long enough to disturb the dead. If you are still here, breathing air on dry land, reading this with two functioning lungs that have never once needed to know where an anoxic boundary sits beneath you, you are the side of this story that one. Vren's kind tried something else entirely. And for roughly 20 million years, in one inland sea that the rest of the planet barely remembers existed, it actually worked. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me which detail you're still thinking about. And tell me where in the world you're watching this from. This channel exists for people who want to understand what came before everything we call normal, and just how strange normal actually had to become to get here.